From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Reagan Smith. I'm Deputy General Counsel of the Copyright Office, and maybe we can go around and introduce ourselves, starting with Jason and ending with Alex.
I'm Jason Sloan, Attorney Advisor in the General Counsel's Office of the Copyright Office.
Julie Saltman, Assistant General Counsel in the Copyright Office.
Kevin Amer, Senior Counsel in the Office of Policy and International Affairs, the Copyright Office.
Anna Chevet, Assistant General Counsel at the Copyright Office.
And I'm Rafi Goldberg. I'm a policy analyst at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration.
Hi, Christian Troncoso with BSA, the Software. Christian Troncoso with BSA, the Software Alliance Policy Director.
I'm Jonathan Zook from the Innovators Network Foundation, but here speaking on behalf of ACT, the App Association, of which I was president for 20 years.
Chris Moore, Software and Information Industry Association.
David Taylor, today here on behalf of DVD, CCA, and AACSLA.
Matt Williams from Mitchell, Silberberg, and NUP. I'm here for AAP, ESA, MPAA, and RIAA.
Steve England from Jenner and Block here on behalf of what we've referred to as the election system providers, Dominion, ESNS, and HART.
Kit Walsh from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm here on behalf of Professor Matthew Green.
Jay Freeman, Soric IT, the developer of Cydia for jailbroken iPhones.
Hi everyone, my name is Joseph Lorenzo Hall. I'm the Chief Technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology.
I'm Harley Geiger, Director of Public Policy at Rapid7.
I'm Alex Salderman. I'm a security researcher and professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan.
Blake Reed from the Samuelson Glushko Technology Law and Policy Clinic at the University of Colorado. We're here representing Professor Halderman and Professor Ed Felton. Thanks.
Brett Hildebrand, student attorney.
And Alice Kamada, student attorney at the Samuelson Glushko Clinic.
Okay, terrific. So I think that this is our largest panel of the rulemaking, so it's also our last panel of the day. If we need to go over a little bit, we can, but we'll try to make sure everyone gets a chance to say what they need to say about the topics. In terms of structure, I think we would like to generally follow, there's an existing exemption for security research in the statute. There's also a temporary exemption, which the registrar has concluded it's appropriate to recommend renewal for. However, so we're really talking about modifying that temporary exemption. Now, Professors Felton and Halderman have identified 5 specific areas, and I think that plus election system specific questions are the 6 topic areas we'd like to focus on, although of course if anything else comes up, we can look at it under those lenses too, but those would be sort of the buckets upon which I think we'd plan to progress in our questioning. So the first bucket I'd like to turn to is the device limitation. So right now there's a list of enumerated devices, all of which must be lawfully acquired in order to engage in security research, and I would like to understand if this regulatory exemption were to be recommended for modification, how it should do so. And I think the first question is whether it could at least be limited to computer programs or whether there's something in the record beyond computer programs. So just tip your placard up if you'd like to speak. Mr. Reed, Professor Reed.
Sure. So I think we're comfortable with that piece of the existing exemption, that it's recommended or that it exempts the study of computer programs. We did make an allusion to ancillary copyrighted works that might be included in computer programs, so that those might be user interface elements or might be pictorial, graphical, sculptural works or music or something that might be part of a piece of computer software that by virtue of accessing a computer software by breaking a TPM, you might in an incidental way, get access to that. That's obviously not the target of the circumvention. The target of the circumvention is in every case the code, but we wanted to clarify that piece of it. Other than that, that sort of ancillary add-on, I think we're comfortable with computer software.
Okay, I guess I wonder if someone could speak to whether Section 1201 is, what types of research Section 1201 is currently inhibiting, giving in, factoring in the regulatory exemption. Is it not possible to get permission to engage in security research outside of the current exemption? Ms. Walsh?
So Professor Green does research and seeks to do research on devices that are not clearly devices intended for use by individual consumers. So these are things like hardware security modules that are used to secure credit card transactions. There are things like industrial grade firewalls that are used at a business scale and not typically at an individual scale. Things like non-implanted medical devices. So if you look at an implanted, basically a defibrillator that's implanted, there are a couple of components of it. So you have the implanted device, you have the home monitoring system, which are referred to in the current exemption. But another critical component of that system is the programming wand that's used to interface with that, and security vulnerabilities could be located there that would threaten that system. So those are some examples, as well as toll collection systems for public transit, for vehicles, where there's a security research need, there are potential vulnerabilities, and when Professor Green approaches them, he has to take a black boxing approach. So he's not able to circumvent in order to look at the code. He has to reverse engineer in a black box manner that doesn't give you confidence that in fact there aren't vulnerabilities. It's just by looking at this small portion of the attack surface, we can say there is or is not a vulnerability here, but there's an extensive additional attack surface that a wrongdoer would be able to take advantage of that good faith security researchers aren't able to vet.
So in the case of the toll collection system, can he get permission to look at it outside of this black box to look at the actual code, or why is Section 1201 or is not the obstacle to the research you would like to do?
Right. So for these devices, independent security researchers like Professor Green are not able to get authorization from the rights holder in order to do that research.
What about is the rights holder the same person as the owner of the toll collection system?
I'm using rights holder. I was using rights holder to refer to the copyright owner as well as the TPM manufacturer, basically anyone with standing to bring a suit under Section 1201. Being the owner of the toll collection system doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to do this work. So the exemption is necessary regardless of, I guess if you're asking, would he be seeking to do this research on a toll collection system where the owner is not authorizing him to do it, the answer is no.
Okay. Professor Halderman?
Yes, so there are a number of different kinds of systems beyond what the existing exemption permits that are of interest to me and to other security researchers. Things like traffic control systems, the systems that in a municipality change the state of the traffic signals. Can you access traffic lights and other traffic control devices in order to cause them to behave incorrectly? Beyond that, things like the networking equipment used by businesses and institutions or internet service providers, the industrial control equipment used by factories or used in other industrial facilities, the avionics on airplanes or the control software on drones that are used commercially. These are just a few examples of classes of equipment well beyond consumer devices. In fact, I would say that most security research, or a large fraction of security research, really isn't about devices that individual consumers are using, but it's about devices that are critical to business, to industry, to making the communications networks and the systems that we all rely on operate correctly and securely.
And do you agree with Ms. Walsh that you're not seeking to do anything where you wouldn't have permission from the sort of systems owner, if not the rights holder or TPM holder, for example, whoever is in charge of the traffic control system? And how do you go about getting that permission in advance, or would you?
So in general, security researchers don't try to do research on systems where they don't have some permission to come in and access that system, except in cases of things that are just generally available and observable to the public. Like you would go out, one category of research there is just looking at the devices, at the websites that are accessible on the internet and asking questions about them broadly, but in a non-invasive way. But in general, if I were another researcher who's going to perform testing on a device or a piece of equipment, we're going to be doing so with the permission of the device owner.
Mr. Geiger? Thank you.
So I just wanted to make the point that for some of these categories, some of these other categories, we're not just necessarily talking about scenarios where a researcher goes to infrastructure held in another building or owned by another person. That in many cases, for example, avionics, you can actually buy this equipment online. Like its used equipment is actually available for a price on eBay. You can just buy the equipment and have it there. Now, I don't know, it's available to an individual person, but may not necessarily fit within the bounds of the device description that is in the current rule. So just wanted to make clear that you can be the owner of the hardware in research scenarios and still be outside of these device limitations. And there are some very compelling, we think some very serious cybersecurity issues in several of the categories that Professor Halderman just mentioned, not without limit being avionics and drones. Now, we're not advocating for a complete removal of the device limit. I think that it makes sense to have some limits given potential negative scenarios, negative externalities. But some of them we do think should be included and reflected.
How would you structure a device limitation based on the record of uses that people seek to do, and given what you said?
I think that I think it's difficult. B, I think that the issue is it comes down to the individual devices designed for individual consumer use, or primarily for individual consumer use. It creates a gray area for things like small office, home office, but also for, as I said, hardware that an individual consumer can purchase. So I guess I have to get back to you on specific language. I just wanted the record to reflect those points.
Could I just clarify one thing you said? So did you suggest that the exemption as it's currently written would in some cases not allow you to do the kind of research you're talking about on a device that you've lawfully purchased as distinguished from the software? Because the exception talks about lawfully acquired device or machine. So that to me doesn't speak to the concern about whether the software is lawfully owned or whether it's licensed or something else.
No, I'm not talking about the lawfully acquired device. I was talking about the limitation on type of device.
In a consumer use.
So I understand that you're saying that you want to expand to systems that may not be a device that you can, to the extent you're talking about infrastructure or something that's not a device that you can own. But I thought I heard you say that there was a concern that you would be limited in the research you could do on a device that you've lawfully acquired, and I just wanted to clarify that.
I thought I did clarify. So if you lawfully acquire the device, but the device is not one that is generally for consumer use.
No, I understand, right.
Yeah,
right.
That's, okay.
Mr. Hall?
So certainly the statutory exemption is inadequate. I think the registrar's report on 1201 made a good case for that. There are a set of things here that we're particularly concerned with. When it comes to specifically to gaining authorization, you had asked how difficult is it to gain authorization. This is only tangentially in the record due to a footnote from the paper that the CDT had provided that we put into the record. There was a study recently by Professor Stefan Savage, where they actually empirically tested the ability to get affirmative authorization from companies to do things like circumvention of TPMs, and it was abysmally poor in terms of the response. Academic researchers got a better response than non-academic researchers, but even academic researchers, I think it was in the 10 or 20% level of even trying as hard as you can, trying to get authorization for these kinds of things.
Well, then, do you agree with Ms. Walsh and I guess Professor Halderman that if you couldn't get permission from the hardware owner or the person who owns the thing, that you could not, that an exemption would be improper for the office to
So there's
recommend?
certainly forms of security research that we value that that because of how they're designed cannot by design get authorization, but those are not necessarily in the circumvention of TPM space. I could probably think of one involving remote access to like locks, like doors and things like that, but you don't want me to make something up.
No.
So I won't.
Ms. Walsh?
I want to make sure that the potential confusion that arose from Mr. Geiger's comment is resolved. I think what Mr. Geiger was saying is there are devices that are not intended for use by individual consumers, which you nonetheless are able to purchase. You can get old voting machines at a county clerk's auction. You can get hardware security modules and industrial grade firewall equipment to do security research. So the mere fact that you're able to acquire them doesn't seem to clearly fall within the language of the existing exemption.
Professor Reed?
Just to pick up on a couple of points, I imagine we'll get in the subsequent questions into the question of your ability to lawfully acquire a device. There's obviously been some concerns raised by opponents in the record about the extent to which restrictions on the transfer of whether it's an ownership or a license in software and the extent to which those might be intertwined with contractual provisions that purport to prohibit resale and all of those sort of things. So we have highlighted in the record some ambiguity about the lawfully acquired provision and have asked to get rid of that. So I
So
hope
that's another one of our buckets, and we are excited to talk about that a little bit later.
Perfect. A couple of other quick clarifications. One, I want to make sure as we're talking about getting permission from the owner of the device or the system, that in many cases is not going to be the copyright holder. And that may be implicit from the discussion here, but I want to make sure that's
I think that's what we're
clear.
trying to build out, because if you don't have the permission from the person who owns the physical device, or, you know, assuming there's a physical device or the actual device or the copyright owner, it becomes less obvious to me, at least, that 1201 is the thing preventing you from engaging in the security research, for one, and two, it might affect the non-infringing use analysis.
So just to give an example on that front, we might talk about doing a security research experiment on the HVAC system in a building. Now, in a case like that, we're obviously going to do coordination with the owner or the operator of the building, so the folks who do facilities management, make sure that the inhabitants of the building are safe and all of that sort of thing. However, the HVAC system might be designed by a third-party vendor and encumbered with some sort of technological protection measure with whom we're not going to go seek permission, and we are seeking to cover that scenario in the ambit of this exemption. So I just want to make sure that piece is clear.
Do you think the owner of the HVAC software would not give permission, or have you?
I'll defer to Alex and Joe to speak further to that.
I wonder if any of the software people know whether it's likely that permission is not given for security research on these sort of Internet of, industrial grade things. Professor Halderman, I guess.
The problem is most often not that companies wouldn't give permission if they were to fully analyze the question. It's that companies are not reachable to contact for security-related purposes. So in many studies that I've done where we found vulnerabilities in large classes of devices and gone to try to reach out to the manufacturers afterwards just to let them know about the vulnerability, that we have a real problem in their system that's affecting people and they need to fix. They haven't been responsive or reachable to those requests. So if you're not directly a customer of a vendor, you aren't the individual who bought a support contract from them, the device is out of service and no longer being supported, it can be extremely difficult to get a company to act on such a request.
Thank you, Mr. Troncoso.
So I can't speak specifically to whether HVAC or building owners or operators do or do not give permission, but I think I just wanted to comment generally on the request to remove the device limitation, just to point out that I think the removal of that limitation is going to make for just an exceptionally broad category of exemption. And I don't think that, we need to look closely at whether proponents of that request are meeting their burden with respect to that entire new class. And so it's worth pointing out that at least for like industrial control systems, oftentimes there are regulatory requirements that the owner or operator of an ICS in a highly regulated industry needs to perform its own security testing on those systems. So that suggests to me that there are opportunities for this type of independent research, at least in some of the contexts that are going to get dragged into this exemption if we go down the path of sort of opening it up to all forms of systems. And so again, just not to belabor the point, I think there certainly will be categories of devices for which authorization to perform security research is a viable path if we remove the device limitation entirely.
One question, and this, maybe Mr. England can also speak to this too, is I've noticed that everyone has been talking about devices that are not consumer devices, but still using the word device, if that makes sense. And whether if an exemption were brought in based on this description of uses things people want to research to be devices which are not necessarily consumer devices, whether this solves some of the concern that the office might be granting an exemption for beyond a narrow and focused subset of work. So if it is software on devices. So starting with Mr. England.
Sure. So to take your last question first, I think the proposal that's been made here is beyond the scope of a permissible class in this proceeding. It is essentially all software once you remove the device limitation. And,
I guess I just said, what if it's software on devices?
So I think that is narrower, but there are a lot of devices in the world, and that kind of goes to your previous question and Mr. Tronsko's response, which I wanted to follow up with because that's very much the position of the election systems providers. I think once you remove the device limitation, there are two kinds of election software that are relevant, one of which is addressed by your suggestion of referring to devices, one not. So there is software in the election context that is intended for use on specific kinds of devices, like voting machines or tabulators. There is also software that is intended to run on general purpose computers. And so if you retain some kind of special purpose device limitation, you would at least take the general purpose computer software off the table. But following up on Mr. Tronsko's point, in the election context, there are abundant opportunities for independent testing and consent when it's to be had. So as described in our written comments, the Election Assistance Commission has voluntary voting system guidelines. Many products in the marketplace, voting products in the marketplace, are independently tested by federally certified labs to conform to those. Many states and localities have their own certification requirements. As part of the procurement process, there can potentially be additional testing, and the election systems providers and states and localities cooperate to authorize testing in these contexts. And there's been other testing beyond the certification procurement processes. There was in 2007 in California a so-called top-to-bottom review, and I think one of the proponents talks about that in his comments. But the evidence in the record shows that the states and localities are not particularly interested in working with independent testing organizations, independent researchers to do testing beyond that, to heard from the National Association of Secretaries of State and from the Secretary of State of North Dakota that they like the certification and testing processes that exist and are not interested in having people testing without consent.
Okay, Mr. Williams?
Thank you. Most of the devices that are of interest to my clients are already covered by the consumer devices provision. So I think from our point of view, what you're describing, just expanding it to a somewhat broader category of devices is of less concern than some of the other things that have been mentioned about network access or database access. And I appreciate Blake saying that, they're not looking to get to things other than software, but that sometimes incidentally or as an ancillary matter, they may also access other types of works, and I think he even included music. That's really our concern, is that if you go beyond devices and open up things like online databases of content, that could really lead to some significant harms. And although I know that the individuals in the room today are acting in good faith and doing their best to avoid any mistakes, not everyone is always going to be able to avoid mistakes. And so I just think it's pretty dangerous to open up kind of testing of internet-based databases of content.
Okay, so Professor Halderman, if you could go to that question, and I don't know if it was you or Professor Green who wants to research or is researching internet-wide scanning, or I think the cyber physical systems. Are those things still devices?
Yes, I am researching internet-wide scanning, and just for a little bit of context, internet-wide scanning is now one of the most important methodologies for studying the health of security across the internet as an ecosystem, of considering the entire global population of computers in an epidemiological way and tracking how vulnerabilities are patched or being exploited. And so internet-wide scanning involves connecting to every device on the internet with a public IP address and attempting to make usually just a normal connection as someone from the public trying to access that machine would, and observing what comes back. That is an absolutely essential methodology for the security community, but one where we necessarily cannot in advance seek the permission of every device holder. Because every device holder is everyone running a computer that is serving public connections.
So in that instance, you're trying to make connections with other internet users or devices. How is Section 1201, it sounds like you're able to conduct that research currently?
So what we worry about with 1201 is the ambiguity of whether this is going to be permitted or not. And I think the very...
well, what circumvention are you engaging in this internet-wide scanning research?
Well, we're making a handshake to every remote computer, and we don't know in advance of making that handshake whether the system we're connecting to is employing some kind of not very well-functioning access control mechanism that's intended to prevent those handshakes from succeeding. So I think the worry is that for certain systems, merely making a handshake to them might be construed as violating an access control mechanism. Perhaps the mechanism is one in which just the address of the remote system not being published to the world, or links to that system being made available to others, is intended to keep people from accessing it. And internet-wide scanning would be incidentally bypassing that.
Could I just ask, so are there other types of research that you would like to do? I mean, it sounds like you're saying that, authorization would be impractical in that circumstance to do that type of research. Are there other types of research where an authorization requirement or a requirement that you make a good faith effort to seek permission of the device owner or the operator of the system would be inadequate for the research you'd like to do.
If I can chime in on this one, I'm very concerned about the idea that we're going to insert a permission structure for a few reasons here, that we're talking about this idea of a permission structure. The first is we're not talking about situations where you can necessarily track someone down, but even if you can, we are trying to analyze legal risk ex ante. We're trying to understand when we're advising a researcher whether this is going to be copacetic or whether somebody is going to come after them. The mere act of asking for permission might well be answered positively, but it might well be answered negatively, and it might well be answered so negatively that there's a threat of a lawsuit. A letter gets sent to the dean of a school. A letter gets sent to the organizer of a conference. It might even be a situation where there's not an access control present. It might be a situation where there's no copyrighted work present, but someone is invoking the DMCA as the nature of as the underlying threat.
Right.
And so what we're trying to get at here is the adverse effects that we're required to demonstrate on the statute is that we are making non-infringing uses of copyrighted works,
And
right?
again, yeah, and that's helpful. And I mean, just to be clear, I'm not talking about permission of the owner of the copyright on the software. I'm talking about the owner of the, the toll collection system, or the the building that you're trying to research the HVAC system on. I mean, and I think we're trying to sort of, if we're going to sort of expand the existing exemption, which is conditioned on the device being lawfully acquired, and I know we're going to talk about that condition later on, is it a burden on your research in general to, and it sounds like it was consistent with your general practice, apart from maybe the internet-wide scanning, to try to seek authorization from the owner of whatever device or system you're researching.
So if security researchers are doing research that has the possibility of causing harm to the operator of a device, they're going to make sure that that device is one that they have that they own or have the permission of the device owner to test with, and they're going to take steps to mitigate that harm. But in other cases where security research doesn't carry a possibility of harming the public or the owner of the device or the device itself, these are cases where we may just want to be measuring something about the world and the population. Doing a measurement that involves the cell phones in this room or the Wi-Fi devices in a neighborhood. That might be a case where we aren't going to necessarily need to go and get the permission of device
Sorry,
holders.
if you wanted to security research the cell phones of all the people in this room, you would not need our permission? What would you be doing, and what would you be circumventing? Why would that be
So if there was a question about whether the cell phones operating in a particular space were running a network protocol that was vulnerable or had received software updates, if we wanted to anonymously measure the population in order to track the frequency of software updates or the uptake of new versions of software, that's an example of a scenario where it's basically just observing the world rather than infiltrating.
In that example, do you have any concerns about other laws such as the CFAA? It just strikes me as like, would you be literally circumventing everybody's individual cell phone here without their permission? I wonder if this is like a hypothetical that went off, or if this is an actual research project.
I think the response to that is no. Obviously, researchers are considering a wide variety of other constraints on what they can do, and I assume we'll talk about this in more detail when we get to the other laws section. But I think the important consideration for us here is we have now diverged a very long way from talking about anything to do with copyright or the intent of the DMCA. We're talking about a regulatory structure about how security researchers researchers do their work in general, absent copyright concerns. And I think there's a worthwhile discussion to be had, and is happening. For example, computer scientists are having discussions about what the ethics of research look like and how that intersects with institutional review boards and how that intersects with the common rule. We're also having other conversations in the context of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act about how that works. That is not necessarily a discussion that ought to be happening in this room today.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that, but I think we started off saying let's ease up on the limitation of consumer devices because there is a enumerated category of things that security researchers want to research, and perhaps it's hard to specifically list them out to loosen it up. And then we got into let's, even without the permission, which I guess Professor Green would have sought, research into individual, devices people own without telling them to. And I wonder, I don't know what they're under the copyright law. We'd have to see whether that changes the analysis or not, because that's not the way the office has previously looked at its recommendation.
Well, I mean, I think it might be worthwhile to divert back to the original inquiry, which is whether the device limitation makes sense. And I think what you've heard is for that particular part of the existing exemption, there's a wide variety of software embodied on devices that are either ambiguously, maybe not within the ambit of consumer devices, or are industrial commercial devices that are completely outside of the intended ambit of the existing category. So if we want to stick on that point, I think there's pretty clear evidence in the record of a desire to do research on those categories of devices in ways that permission from the copyright holder is not forthcoming. Again, to this question about permission from the device holder, I think is a different question.
Okay, let's, I think we'd like to do the last round on the device limitation. We'll go to controlled environment next, just to give a roadmap. So just going down the line, Mr. Hall.
Thank you. Just wanted to say a couple things about what the election system providers, election service providers, election system providers said. There are two people on this panel who were part of large, mostly academic efforts to study voting systems. The election systems providers were dragged kicking and screaming to that. And part of that is because the testing that goes in the regulatory testing that happens is not security testing. It's often shake and bake testing, like, is this thing going to withstand being on a semi-truck for 10 years or something like that. The kind of testing that we do as security researchers is more adversarial. In some cases, it's been called open-ended vulnerability testing or penetration testing. You basically ask yourself, what can we do with the public knowledge that's out there with this system? And so it's a little bit different here. I would, unlike Rabbit 7, I think we are asking you to remove the device limitation to the extent you can to apply to software and software-controlled systems. I think, I'm not sure we submitted this in our filing, but I think we would be okay with some extreme limit to that. So for example, there are types of critical infrastructure like nuclear power plants and things like that, water systems, energy systems, that we might want to actually say, no, look, this is a place where it should be a no-go zone for this kind of activity, so to speak. Part of that is on those operators of those systems themselves as well, isolating those systems so that when people touch them or get close to them or are able to access them, they aren't as exposed as many of the systems that we work with today that surround us, including the cameras in front of us right now. And that's really the meat of what we're talking about with the device limitation. Having an enumerated list means every 3 years we have to come back and add more things to it rather than having a presumption that anything with software, anything that's a software control system should be something that security researchers should.
Well, we typically tend to recommend exemptions and library to adopt exemptions, which are based on the record. And in 2015, the record was based on sort of consumer-facing devices. So that is why the language is as it is right now, and we're debating whether to change it.
Yeah, and we tried to supplement the record in our initial filing. We issued another paper that was used for case studies that talked about voting systems, Internet of Things devices, automotive systems, and other kinds of non-land-based vehicles, and one other one. Anyway, but we tried to supplement that to say, look, here's examples of things that security researchers are finding flaws in that we want to not exclude from their attention, but actually include these things in their attention and give them fewer excuses to avoid those kinds of systems.
Okay, Mr. Freeman? Thank you.
So
Another hat that I wear is I'm actually a elected local government official. And so in this comment that came up just a little bit earlier about the statement from the Executive Board of National Association of Secretaries of State, it is very often the case that there will be an issue that will come before the larger body that is not agreed to by all of the individual smaller groups. And I do think it is a little bit weird that if, for example, in our district, we were interested in having some kind of independent security audit for a particular reason, that that would be something that we would only have the opportunity to do during the general testing process, which, as was just mentioned, is largely more for just verifying functionality in many ways. And then to put back on my iPhone jailbreaking hat, I will point out that, the iPhone goes through a tremendous amount of security testing by very smart people at Apple, and yet, time after time, independent security researchers have come and shown vulnerabilities that have made the world a much more secure place by getting those things fixed. And so having the opportunity to have independent security research being able to be done on these systems at the will of independent local governments that are interested in having this this is checked, I think is very important.
And when you say these things, can you, what?
The voting machines, sorry.
Voting machines, okay.
That was the example specifically brought up by the election systems, but.
So, Mr. England, I think you've said that the state and local governments, they may not have the ability to give permission for security research because you're, the companies you represent restricted via license agreements. Do you want to speak on that?
Sure. The point I was making a minute ago was not that point, however.
Right,
So
I'm asking
just
about the specific.
to be clear that the election systems providers do cooperate with their customers to satisfy their customers that their devices are secure. With respect to the license agreements, election system software is licensed pursuant to license agreements that look a lot like commercial software licenses. They contain all the kinds of restrictions on use that you would expect to see in commercial database software and software provided by Mr. Tronsko's clients. So, but among other things, they would prohibit distributing the software that's licensed to, say, a municipality to somebody else. And so that's kind of the point we were making in our comments concerning infringement, that if municipality X is authorized to use a particular piece of software to conduct elections in its jurisdiction, is not authorized to distribute copies of the software to anyone else. It is an infringement for them to provide a copy of that to the security researcher. And their customer, they're certainly come and talk to the vendor about whether that's something they'd like to do.
Well, if the vendor, doesn't the vendor perhaps have a incentive? Is the vendor appropriately incentivized to research, find, and disclose all of the problems?
Absolutely. It's a competitive market. My three clients, well, jointly represented today, are commercial competitors with each other. And a very important feature that they sell is security. In addition, there are these certification requirements, both federal and state and local, which, contrary to something Mr. Hall had said, or at least implied, sort of do include some security requirements. So security is something that is great concern to the systems providers and their customers. And
have they ever, you said that not even state and local governments would qualify as owners. Are there examples where the companies you're here representing would have turned down requests for security research?
Independence of their customers?
Well, I think maybe what you're getting, so, has there ever been a situation where a government has requested a term in the license or requested permission from the vendor, from your clients, to allow third-party researchers to conduct security research on the software?
No. I don't know the specific answer to that question. Among
Um,
other things, I don't
can-
know whether any state and local, to the extent to which state and local governments have ever asked. I do know that there are circumstances where state and local governments have expressed a desire to conduct security testing, and that has happened.
I'm just thinking, Mr. Freeman mentioned, his jurisdiction. If his jurisdiction decided that it wanted to allow, in addition to the research that it does itself, wanted to bring in Mr. Halderman or, an academic institution to conduct third-party research on the voting software, do you think that's something that that your organizations would be amenable to?
They should certainly talk to the vendor of their equipment, and they have some market power. That sort of thing has happened.
Okay, I think maybe we can hear from Professor Halderman, who on the other side has had
Yeah,
experience.
there absolutely have been cases where local governments have wanted to conduct independent security testing on voting systems and have either been denied permission or have refrained from seeking permission because they were convinced it would be denied if sought. And that has been a constant inhibition to independent security testing of voting systems since the introduction of computer voting. This is getting all the more urgent to perform independent testing of voting systems. The Senate Intelligence Committee, which has been investigating interference in and hacking of election infrastructure, recommended just last month that states and local governments pursue security testing from the Department of Homeland Security for their election infrastructure. And furthermore, because the Department of Homeland Security doesn't have the resources to test every local and state system in a timely way, the Senate Intelligence Committee recommended recommended the use of private security testing firms as well to perform that same kind of test. So it's essential to allow non-government security testing of election systems, be it at the local level or the state level, in order to make sure that they're going to be secure even for this year's elections.
So I hear a couple of things out of what you're saying. I hear first, it sounds like you disagree with Mr. England that the independent research is exhausted on voting systems, okay. But secondly, if the Senate Intelligence, if this is happening, how is Section 1201, or is it proving an obstacle to this independent research if there is a lot of resources and other governmental resources mobilizing to making this research happen?
Well, so 1201 is going to be a significant concern if a state or local government came to me today and asked me to participate in such a test. I would have to have a serious conversation with my attorneys about whether I would be at risk of doing that research due to 1201.
Would you go to the copyright owner? If you sought permission, it would alleviate that problem.
Well, so if we sought permission, if I sought permission to do such testing, I'm not sure it would be granted. In fact, my strong suspicion is that if a local government wanted to bring me in to do a security test of the voting machines from the makers represented here today, that those companies would object.
Mr. Moore?
We don't necessarily have a dog in the voting fight. What we are concerned about is the specificity of the record with respect to particular kinds of tailoring of any issued exemption. And this is kind of a good example of that, because as I listen to this, it strikes me that a lot of this ought to be covered by 1201E, which does not prohibit any lawfully authorized information. I'm going to insert ellipses here. Section does not prohibit any lawfully authorized information security or intelligence activity of an employee of the United States, a state, or a political subdivision of a state, or a person acting pursuant to a contract of the United States, a state, or a political subdivision of this state. And for purposes of this section, information security means activities carried out in order to identify and address the vulnerabilities of a government computer, computer system, or computer network. So to the extent that there is a need for a further exemption beyond what's in the statute already, I'm puzzled as to what it is that our friends would like to do that is not allowed by 1201E.
Professor Reed? If you want to respond to that directly, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chime in. And thinking back to 10 years ago when we sat and first talked about 1201J and heard a similar argument about the extent to which 1201J might apply.
I mean, though, specifically when we're talking about voting systems, and
So
everyone's been discussing state and local governments and an intelligence department, there seems to be a large government. I'm not sure, it might be a different question.
Sure. So, and the first thing I'll say is if litigation were ever instituted over this, and Professor Halderman, for example, was working with a local government, one of the first to do independent security testing, and the DMCA was brought up by one of the election vendors as a claim, very likely one of the first things we would assert as a defense is 1201E. Now, I don't think I have to tell you that 1201E, at least to the best of my knowledge, has never been tested in court, and there are a number of ambiguous provisions. And I'd note that this, as far as I'm aware, has not been briefed on the record. But I'd note that it refers to investigative, protective, information security, or intelligence activity. Now, whether the scope of security testing of election system falls within the ambit of those terms, I'm not sure. And because we haven't had an opportunity to brief this on the record, I'm uncomfortable sitting here today saying, yes, absolutely, 1201E is going to cover that. But to the extent that the office opines that 1201E is likely to cover the types of activities that we're talking about today, as we've asked in the past with 1201J, positive interpretations of the scope of the built-in exemptions are helpful. The lack of clarity about them is the reason that we have come and asked for a specific exemption that covers the activity. But if it's the office's perspective that 1201E covers everything that we've asked for in our briefs that pertains to election security, that would be very helpful to have a declaration in the final rule to that effect.
I think it would have to be in concert with someone connected to a state, because that's what 1201E does, but it's much shorter than 1201J. So in some ways, I think it's a little less ambiguous. So Ms. Walsh, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we've discussed the use case where a voting machine is acquired by independent researchers because we all, as residents of the United States, have an interest in the integrity of our elections. And so an independent researcher who acquires the voting machine, does research, doesn't necessarily have a government sponsor.
But that's permitted under the current exemption, right? I mean, if you're going to test a live election system, shouldn't you somehow coordinate with a local facility or state facility? I mean, right now, a decommissioned voting machine or something not networked, not connected, an independent researcher can get that and can conduct that research.
It's subject to the other limitations in the existing exemption.
Yes.
Yes. I also wanted to add, when we've had a few references to seeking permission from the copyright owner, one of the issues with that, and one of the reasons why it's dangerous to even approach a copyright owner in the first place, is because often what security researchers are doing is they're criticizing the functional aspects of the works. They are discovering vulnerabilities and putting public pressure on the companies to get them fixed. And when the election vendors, for instance, say that they compete on security, that's competing on the perception of security of their purchasers, and that's part of why there's a financial interest from these companies not to allow their brand to be tarnished by truthful reporting about vulnerabilities in their software.
Mr. Zuck, I think you've been waiting for a while.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan Zuck, for the record. I'm not an attorney, so I won't delve into the rule itself as much as to try to backstop this a little bit with a philosophical point that I think is going to end up being a framework from which I'd want to approach this conversation going forward, which is that if there's a TPM in place, the default ought to be to leave it in place. And so this idea of permissionless access on a broader and broader scale, I think needs to be viewed with some scrutiny. And that the idea that the majority of the cases, the answer is no, I think is okay, right? It's the idea that the de facto, the default should be that anybody that wants to perform research should be able to do it, and we should get all of the doubt out of the way for doing it, feels like the wrong place to start the conversation. So maybe only 20% get back, maybe 20% of researchers having access to your system is plenty, for example, for particular security testing. So I just want to say that I think from a philosophical standpoint, we ought to start from the standpoint, as the law does, calling it an exemption, that everything isn't by default okay, and that we should just get every barrier out of the way, every ambiguity out of the way for anybody doing whatever they want to do, and instead make it about permission, make it about exemptions, and start from that place. So maybe voting machines are something that need further discussion, but creating this broad expansion of the exemption feels like the wrong move, just in an effort to clear the clutter for anybody that wants to get at these systems for any reason.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Williams, if you wanted to be responsive to what has been raised before, also I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is the controlled environment limitation. If you have any thoughts on whether that is an important limitation in the current temporary regulation towards the statutory factors and what were our project here under 1201A1.
Sure, thank you. I did want to respond to something Blake said earlier, just so that it didn't go left unaddressed. And I know we're trying to go bucket by bucket, but his comment was kind of expansive in covering the purpose why we're here in general. So I'm going to speak to that first, and then I'll answer your question. When we were discussing whether someone who wanted to circumvent everyone's cell phones in the room in order to do some research should need everyone's permission, and if so, whether that might also violate the CFAA. The point was made that somehow, because a lot of security research is non-infringing, that all of this is just outside of the scope of what Congress intended to address in the DMCA, and that it's completely outside of Section 1201, and therefore the office should not be engaged in the careful process that it has engaged in to date to try to draw some limitations and make sure that you're defining a class of works that doesn't lead to abuse. And I just think the discussion we've been having about 1201E, about 1201J, it just shows that that's not true, that Congress was very aware of these issues, that Congress addressed them in various provisions in the statute, and then it also gave you the authority to move beyond those provisions if a very good record was built. And part of what Congress did in 1201J was also refer to other laws, including the CFAA. And so I think the approach you've been taking, trying to come up with common sense limitations, referring to the other laws limitation, all of that is well within your purview, and all of this was anticipated to some degree by Congress. The controlled environment limitation to me is just another one of those common sense limitations. I don't see it as unduly burdensome to suggest that when you're engaging in this kind of activity, you take some special care to prevent harm occurring. And so I think that should be retained.
Thank you. Mr. Geiger, can you talk about the controlled environment limitation and what research that's impeding, and including whether perhaps the office could provide interpretive guidance as opposed to, say, removing it entirely to assuage sort of protecting the research that is, I guess, not dangerous from other types of research, which I think every researcher who has filed a comment in has said there are strict ethical norms and rules that may depend upon what is being researched, but no one is really endorsing, I guess, non-safe research, or if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
So I'm sensing from you that is, that you want me to focus on just the controlled environment portion. I'd actually put my card up to address some of the things that were momentarily said, but they may fall better under the other laws bucket. I'm happy to wait for that bucket in order to address the legislative history on that if you'd prefer.
If we can stick with controlled environment now, I think that might help keep it orderly, and I'll certainly let you say get back to you when we get to the other laws. Yep. Mr. Reed, Professor Reed?
I wanted to just quickly circle back to 1201E and point out as a technical matter, one reason 1201E won't work in many situations because it doesn't apply to territories of the United States, including Puerto Rico. So there's at least going to be a number of elections where voting machines are going to be deployed where it's directly not applicable. I wanted to respond to Mr. Williams' point about the notion of addressing non-copyright concerns in this proceeding. And there was sort of a watershed moment in the last hearing where all the other agencies descended and said, whoa, hold on a second, we've got all these other policy concerns that relate to cybersecurity, that relate to environmental protection, that relate to all of this other stuff. And the office, for better or for worse, accommodated that interest by delaying the rollout of the last security exemption by a year and setting an expectation that other agencies would have time to respond. To the best of my knowledge, there's almost nothing on the record that suggests anything happened as a result of that. In other words, that agencies came in and said, uh-oh, we have got real problems with this exemption, and we need to create new policies, new regimes to accommodate the fact that security researchers are going to be coming in and doing new types of work. And the office said in its policy study that it was going to, that was the shot that everyone had to bring up these non-copyright concerns, and that the office did not expect that it would be addressing health, safety, and environmental concerns here. So I want to underscore that historical point, not because we don't think that safety is important. Obviously it is, and Alex will speak to that. But we don't think this is the appropriate venue in which to be considering that. We don't think that copyright policy and the body that is responsible with setting the contours of copyright policy ought also be setting the contours of responsible security research. There are a lot of complicated questions about how this shakes out, and I think the responses on the record about the nature of the controlled environment limitation go exactly to this. I counted at least 3 different interpretations of exactly what that means from the opponents. So that very ambiguity is the problem, and also I don't think we want the Copyright Office going in and being more specific about what we mean by that. We want you to defer to other agencies who, by the way, haven't raised any concerns about it on the record this time around, and to researchers who are engaged in good faith security research to set those contours themselves. And I think the proponents of this exemption are among the most credible and trustworthy and serious security researchers that do this kind of work. And the insinuation that they need a check from the Copyright Office to tell them how to do their work, I think is inappropriate.
So
I don't think I'm making any insinuation. I think we're trying to follow from the law and from the existing statutory exemptions as well as what the legislative history is telling us to do. I mean, we're not questioning the, I guess, practices of any participant here. I think that should be clear. Yes.
I just wanted, and Mr. Haldeman, Professor Haldeman, you may want to address this, or Professor Reed, you can as well. But I mean, to sort of clarify this purported ambiguity about controlled environment, I mean, I think that grew out of what a lot of commenters have described as sort of universal agreement in the last rulemaking that this sort of testing shouldn't extend to live environments, live testing. And then I know, Professor Haldeman, in your reply comments, you said, well, there should be a distinction between live testing and testing in real-life environments carefully designed to avoid harm. To me, that latter phrase sounds a lot like controlled environment, as sort of a layperson. And so I wonder, is there a distinction there? Is there, are there types of environments that are uncontrolled, but that nevertheless sort of have the sort of safeguards that you seem to be talking about?
Well, so let me just start by emphasizing that the security community and security research absolutely recognizes an obligation and a community norm of testing security in a way that is safe, that is not harmful to the general public or to the operators of systems. And I think that ethical core of our behavior of researchers is a large part of what separates security research from activities that are harmful and malicious. But the problem with the controlled environment limitation is maybe you feel like you have some sense of what a controlled environment looks like. I don't know how to interpret that. And I'm the one having to make that call in the work that I undertake. So a controlled environment, to me, maybe that sounds like that means I have to take the device into the laboratory, isolate it from the rest of the world, and make sure that nothing is going to come in or out of that isolated, controlled environment unless it's accounted for. Something like that. It's that notion of it being a controlled environment that is the part that causes me the most problem, not the notion that security researchers are going to try to design their experiments and their research not to cause harm. Of course we're going to do that. But if you invite me to, say you invite me to test the security of your home network, is that a controlled environment or not? Right? Because it's operating in the real world, we're going to presumably take steps to make sure that I'm not going to destroy the networking equipment in the process of testing it or otherwise leak sensitive data about you. We can do all of those things to make sure that there aren't harms, but I'm still not sure that that's a controlled environment if it's something that's taking place within a person's actual home network.
Well, is it, and that's helpful. I mean, would you say that phrase, or maybe what you see as the ambiguity in that phrase, is imposing a requirement that goes beyond what other laws would require? I mean, I guess another way of asking that is, is it ever lawful to do this kind of research in something that's not reasonably described as a controlled environment according to other laws?
Well, Blake, you're the...
Yeah, so, okay, if I chime in on this point. I think it's important to remember the context in which we are making this evaluation. The evaluation is not when we're sitting down in the example of, say, testing a piece of home networking equipment, whether the person whose home we are in is going to be upset about it. We're going to have a fruitful discussion with them beforehand. If we're testing the HVAC system in a building, it's not that the building owner is going to be upset about it. The context that we're in is, in the software that we are looking at, we are going to find a potentially embarrassing bug that suggests, in fact, this piece of widely deployed software has got a serious security vulnerability that everyone else who has deployed this piece of software has now got to fix. There is a significant incentive for the folks who are the copyright holders in that software, the vendor of that software, to say, we would really like that not to be released. And what are the ways that we're going to shut down the release of that vulnerability or shut down publicity of that vulnerability, shut down conference papers about that vulnerability? Well, we're going to go look at this exemption, and we're going to look at every piece of this exemption and see if we can figure out some way that this research arguably, or maybe even not arguably, but enough that we can assert it in a demand letter, violates the exemption. And we're going to look at that controlled environment limitation and say, we've just been having a 10-minute colloquy about what it means. That's uncertain enough that we are concerned about that, and that means that we can't go to folks that are trying to get some ex ante clarity about the ability to do this and disabuse the notion that there's going to be some serious legal risk when this is ultimately published. So I think it's critical that the office bear in mind that that is the context. It's not the homeowner, it's not the building owner, it's not the operator of the system, it's the copyright holder for whom the release of the vulnerability might be fairly economically devastating that we're concerned about.
I mean, I think one question.
Well, I was going to say, because there are examples, like, for example, like Apple has a page on its website specifically for security researchers to go and tell Apple if they find bugs on the software. So it's not like every company across the board doesn't want that type of information. And so I guess if there's ambiguity about the term controlled environment, which you guys seem to think that there is there another alternative way to or another phrase to use so that obviously you guys are very ethical, no one is saying that you're not, but maybe not everyone to rely on this exemption would be as ethical. So I think it's just trying to put some type of safeguard to protect the public. So I don't know if you have a suggested alternative phrase that could be implemented.
Well, I think the safeguards come from other existing statutes, things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which doesn't talk about a controlled environment. It talks about authorization from the operator of a computing system.
I think the point is that the policy dimensions of how you might want to control an environment, such as we're talking about here, are so broad and so deep and so complicated and so under dispute that to embed all of those considerations in the exemption, that's what we're getting at. It's not that we couldn't have a robust policy discussion about what a controlled environment is and an appropriate way to conduct research. It's that embedding it in this exemption to copyright law is not the appropriate place to do it. And so it's also not to suggest that in situations where, take Apple for example, they might well work closely with security researchers, and that's great. And there might be situations where you're working hand in glove and asking permission. But again, we're talking about the entire industry. We're talking about every single purveyor of software. We're talking about every single device that's out in the world, and we need something that covers all of those possible situations, and that's why we're asking to get rid of this limitation.
So sort of building off of that point, obviously there are companies that not only are willing to work with security researchers, but even have bug bounty programs in some cases. And in fact, I have a few examples. I know Microsoft and Adobe, among others, have bug bounty programs, and they're not necessarily limited to your local devices. They actually, in some cases, invite you to test cloud-based services. Have you had trouble actually taking advantage of something like a bug bounty program because you think it might still be a DMCA violation?
I think the major problem is the companies that don't have bug bounty programs, and which is almost all companies. We're talking about bug bounty programs being things that are provided by a relatively small fraction of companies that are mostly the companies that are already the most responsible actors and security conscious ones. If I were to be doing research about corporate routers and firewalls involved in routing internet traffic that are manufactured by, say, certain Chinese companies that are already suspected of embedding backdoors in their products, I probably would not receive permission from those companies to go and do those tests, but the tests still would be essential for the security and safety of the public.
And if I could just chime in and discourage the office and NTIA from considering incorporating a bug bounty caveat to this limitation, because then we're going to have to sit here for another half an hour and talk about what a bug bounty program is and what features it has to have and what's an appropriate level of response and all of that sort of stuff. And again, that's a complicated policy debate, and this is not the place for it.
Right, so if I could just follow up, I was actually thinking more of trying to get the opposite situation to a lot of what we're talking about, which is, whether you can get to permission or not. I'm just, using that as an example. Sometimes you actually, have enthusiastic support from the software developers, but, as seemingly, as it's currently worded, a 1201 might, still not allow you to take advantage of those programs. Is that your experience?
So the hypothetical that you're teeing up is a situation where 1201 would prevent a bug bounty program, our researcher from participating in a bug bounty program. I'm not familiar with any particular examples where that's shaken out. You might be able to think about a situation where there are multiple copyright holders involved, and the company running the bug bounty program is one of them, but you then have to go get permission from the other one. Something along those lines.
I think 1201 would be one of the factors that I would be looking for in reviewing the language of the bug bounty permission statement, where the bug bounty is going to say that the company promises not to take legal action against a good faith security researcher under under certain laws, and I'd want to make sure that whatever wording there was there included 1201, definitely.
If we could go to Mr. Troncoso, I think he's been waiting for a while.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on one of the points Blake made. He made reference to the fact that just because some companies have bug bounties doesn't obviate the need for an exemption, and I mean, I would totally concede that point. But I think on the other side is that, you know, just because the researchers in this room abide by the certain norms that would, you know, guide them in the construction of their research projects to mitigate harms to third parties, doesn't mean that every sort of purported security researcher out there is doing the same thing. So I think that counsels that we need to make sure that there are at least reasonable safeguards built into this exemption. And from our perspective, the controlled environment is precisely that. One of the purported sort of interpretations of the controlled environment limitation is that it would require all research to be performed in a lab setting. I mean, I don't think that that's a very reasonable interpretation of that of the limitation, and I'd simply point out that several of the examples that the proponents have proffered of the types of security research they've engaged in under the auspices of the 2015 exemption were not performed in sort of lab settings. So, I mean, we can have a discussion about sort of what the contours of a controlled environment are. And I think it would be reasonable for perhaps the Copyright Office to sort of, you know, to explain that in the context of the recommendation that they make, that you make. But I think, you know, our view is that sort of it is not a lab setting. And I'd also just make the one other point that several of our companies have big security research sort of wings of their companies. So in many ways, Microsoft, for instance, is both a beneficiary of this exemption, as are several of our other companies, and they have not flagged concerns with me in the course of this sort of project that they view these as unreasonable constraints on their ability to perform security research.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I think you were also waiting.
Just a couple of points. Sorry, thanks. Just a couple of points on this. I mean, the first is that, there's a difference. A demand letter is not the statute, in the sense that the fact that somebody makes a threat does not mean that the statute's actually causing it. I think we've probably all seen good examples of creative writing in that context. The second thing I would say that in this instance, we agree with the premise of what Mr. Halderman said, if not the precise language, which is the idea that if the obligation on the researcher is essentially, if they're going to go nosing around, not to cause harm and to take steps to prevent that harm. In the regulation now, that's encompassed by the phrase controlled environment. If that needs to be fleshed out in certain ways, that's fine. The idea of internet-wide scanning, as it's been described in this context, is not something that we're uncomfortable with. I'm not quite sure, again, that that's something that the statute prevents in any way. But to the extent you're looking for areas of consensus, I mean, we don't believe that this limitation should be dropped, but if it's refined further to get at the same condition in a different formulation, that's something I think we would be okay with.
I think Ms. Walsh was next, and I guess maybe in your answer and others, if you want to address that too. I mean, is this something that sort of more clarification would be adequate to address short of dropping the language altogether?
So in answering that question, I'm going to take up Mr. Zuck's invitation to think about what is the default about whether this research is going to be permitted or not. And it's not an abstract philosophical question. It's a question that's answered by the First Amendment. This is protected First Amendment activity. So you need to have a darn good reason to restrict it, and your restrictions have to be narrowly tailored. Congress took the approach of passing this really overbroad law, and it's your problem to try to mitigate some of the overbroad impacts on speech that law has. That's what this rulemaking is here to do. So in that context, none of what we've talked about in the controlled environment context has anything to do with the purpose of Section 1201 of combating infringement. It's all, well, you might hurt somebody, you might commit a tort against somebody. It doesn't speak to the ultimate question of, are there adverse effects on non-infringing uses?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, to the extent that this is unlawful, you know, that it's sort of an academic question, you know, because other laws prohibit you from doing this type of research in an uncontrolled environment, or however you want to describe it, in a way that exposes people to harm. Can we really say that 1201 is the cause of any adverse effect that you're experiencing?
So 1201 increases the adverse effect because it's duplicative, redundant, unnecessary penalization of conduct that may be prohibited by other laws. So that's half of the answer, which is where, well, and I'll expand on that, which is where there actually is some other law that is broken. The other scenario is you don't do it in a controlled environment, you don't actually wind up causing any unlawful harm. You don't actually commit a tort against anybody. There's no harm, but under the language of the exemption, you are potentially liable to the copyright owner for circumventing 1201 because you didn't do it in a controlled environment. So that's one scenario. There is no harm. Other laws don't really apply. In the scenario where you do wind up, say you do automobile research and you run somebody over. Okay, there are tort laws, there are personal injury laws that are generally thought to adequately disincentivize that kind of conduct. People are not counting on Section 1201 of the DMCA to dissuade people from running them over in the streets. And it's illogical if I get harmed by someone who has physically injured me. Sure, I have a cause of action against them, but why does a copyright owner now have a cause of action against that person? How does that remain proportionate to the harm, particularly when Section 1201 has statutory damages and has potential criminal penalties? It doesn't, and it interferes with the ability of other regulatory agencies to say, this is a harm where maybe you should be fined $500, but it's not that big a deal. Like, okay, you're fined $500, but then the copyright owner can sue you, get statutory damages, and if you did it willfully and commercially, you can go to jail.
I mean, we're not affecting what any other regulatory agency can or cannot do.
You are connecting liability under Section 1201 to what other agencies try to do in their regulations. So put yourself in the shoes of, I'm an environmental regulator, and I think that this activity is bad. It's not that bad. I'm going to fine you $500 if you violate it. I think that's the right level of deterrence. And now the Copyright Office has come in and said, but if anyone violates that provision, actually also you have potential criminal penalties and a private cause of action so that the rights holder can come in and penalize you further.
But we haven't removed that from the existing permanent exemption, just to be clear, right? I mean, we haven't come in and affirmatively decided to regulate and put in language. We've said we didn't see a record to remove it. I think from 1201J is what has happened in terms of the Copyright Office's role. I mean, another question for you is Consumers Union filed a comment which in general supported many of the eliminating or amending, I guess, the regulation, but they said the controlled environment limitation is very important for consumer safety. I wonder if you have a thought of why they felt that way, since they perhaps shared Professor Green's views on other points.
So I think something that's very clear is that there is a norm in the security research community that you do your research safely. And that's a professional norm. It's not necessarily something that anyone thinks the government can or should impose as a matter of law. Just like in the journalism context, there have been professional norms about when you disclose victims' names, when you don't. And you might say it's irresponsible as a journalist to violate that norm, but you wouldn't say the government can prohibit you from doing it.
I don't think, that really answers the question of if the Copyright Office were to remove the controlled environment limitation, is it signaling that that norm is not important?
No, the Copyright Office, the professional norms being things that are matters of professional ethics and not government mandates, is an important traditional feature of the way that these speech-related professions operate. It's not clear to me what the authority of the Copyright Office is to impose a limitation like that has nothing to do with whether the activity is infringing or not.
Mr. England?
Yeah, I'd like to just very briefly respond to Ms. Walsh, who said, in essence, that the controlled environment limitations doesn't have anything to do with copyright, and I think that's just wrong. 1201 is about TPMs that are used to control access to copyrighted works, and the ask here by the security researchers is to circumvent those and thereby obtain access to copyrighted work. This becomes somewhat bound up in the consent issues and lawful device, lawful copy issues we were talking about a few minutes ago, but the proponents want all of those limitations to go away. And one thing the controlled environment requirement does for standing alone is prevent someone from hacking into live systems and thereby obtaining access to copyrighted works. So if you do away with the device limitation, as the proponents have asked, and you do away with any kind of consent notion, as the office proposed in the previous panel, and you also do away with the controlled environment limitation, you hack TPMs to obtain unauthorized access to copyrighted works, and that's something that copyright cares about.
Who's next? Mr. Freeman, I think.
I just wanted to respond to the question of if the Copyright Office were to remove this clause, whether that would signal that they believe that that's an appropriate thing to be doing. And I would say that no, because you've been stating that you believe that many of these activities would already be covered by other laws, what I would say that it's doing is it's showing that the Copyright Office is not interested in rewriting in different wording a summary of another law that will then cause a new form of like legal cases to have to be argued about how that new wording is. Instead, it's more just signaling that they're more interested in utilizing the existing legal base and the existing laws than creating more confusion.
But you're also asking us to drop the other laws requirement. So, I mean, I could see the argument that the controlled environment is duplicative of other laws to the extent that they also require provision for public safety, et cetera. But then you're asking us then to take the next step of removing the requirement of compliance with other laws, which is in the permanent exemptions in the statute. So, I mean, I think our thinking has been that there's a basis for inferring that Congress wanted to include compliance with other laws as a condition of 1201 exemptions. So, how do you reconcile sort of wanting us, I mean, if what you're saying is that the controlled environment requirement is duplicative of other laws and it's unnecessary, how do you then take the next step of asking us to drop I guess we're bleeding into the other laws section. So maybe you could address that.
Well, I will say that they are different arguments in a way. I mean, there's different points that would be made about different sections of this. And I mean, I really liked Ms. Walsh's argument about the ones that reference other laws end up causing a situation whereby you can increase the penalty accidentally of another law, or the argument I believe was made by Mr. Reed, which was that maybe it was actually Mr. Hulliner, which is that it will change who is able to make that claim, such as being able to make it randomly. Now it's a copyright owner that's able to come out in order to make an argument, whereas before it was somebody you made a tort against.
Well, maybe we can zigzag between copyright owners and security researchers. So Mr. Williams and then Mr. Hall.
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly touch on the First Amendment issues that Ms. Walsh raised. There have been several opinions, especially at the beginning of application of Section 1201, that addressed the First Amendment issues, Corley and Ramirez and Elcom and others. And they do carefully walk through all of these arguments. They identify it as content neutral. They apply intermediate scrutiny. They observe the existing statutory exemptions that you've been referencing as one of the protections built into the statute. They even discuss cases like journalism cases like New York Times versus United States, and they've all come out and said this statute is perfectly constitutional under the First Amendment. So I just wanted to say that, at least based on those cases, I don't think there's anything inappropriate about you trying to draw similar limitations into these regulatory exemptions as to what Congress did in the statute.
Thank you. So in our joint filing, we actually did, as you asked, Mr. Emmer, provide some narrower language that we think could help. So I think what we actually said was specify the controlled environment requires only that, quote, harmed individuals or the public can be mitigated. So that gives us a little bit more. I am going to point out that we've learned more since we've made this filing. So we did submit a research report as part of the record. Everyone got a copy of that. I don't know what exhibit it is. But in that research report, we actually did a qualitative investigation speaking to hackers and security researchers about what kinds of considerations shape their work. And half of them mentioned the DMCA in some part of the conversation. But the important thing is that when it came to questions about live systems, how far is too far, as an example of a question we asked these researchers and hackers. It was, as you said, there was some unanimity in talking about things like cyber-physical systems that can actually have an effect with the software change on the physical world and can move kinetic things and hurt people. But it's more than just harm to people, right? It's harm to property, machines, things like that, and also invasions of privacy. So you can imagine like wiretapping kinds of things where there are very serious laws that prevent you or should prevent you from doing those kinds of things. And so I think while we do definitely think the easier way is to eliminate the controlled environment specification entirely, there are probably ways to write language that could get at, harm to people, harm to machines, invasions of privacy. That may not be all the one things, but as you can see, it's already becoming a pretty complicated set of things to specify in the exemption text, but I'm sure that we could work on it.
Okay, thank you. So I think we'll go Mr. Moore, then Mr. Geiger.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a couple of things. First is the idea that professional norms are not part of or shouldn't be codified in the law. I mean, I'd suggest that happens all the time. I'd suggest it also happens in the First Amendment context, especially when you think of when you're trying to prove libel and you're defending and you have to, as a reporter, prove that you were following established journalistic practice, that you were not reckless. That's part of the First Amendment law. There's no categorical right to do whatever you want, even if it's for a noble purpose, if it violates some other statute. Other examples, a notable example where trade usage is incorporated broadly into a variety of situations is Article 2 of the UCC, where course of dealing, usage of trade, etc. What we believe the controlled environment did was to simply incorporate what the kind of thing that things that the responsible folks at this table tend to do when they do security research. And that's why we supported the inclusion of that language. We didn't object to the reissuance of this particular exemption and welcome dialogue on how to construct that particular point better. But the premise of that particular attack is not one that I think we accept. The second thing that when crafting this exemption, and this goes to the overlapping remedy problem, I mean, that's an interesting policy question. I'm not sure that once you get, it's one thing to discuss it in terms of a First Amendment analysis, in terms of this statute is not narrowly tailored because there are all these other laws that deal with that. I'm not sure that's the way the analysis is supposed to work. I think it's more has to do with this statute cuts off the following types of speech, and there are other ways to do it. And so if you get sidetracked, my concern is that if you go down that road too far, you're going to get sidetracked into things that aren't necessarily relevant to what the statute charges you to do.
So the conversation has bled frequently into the question of other laws, and in
Yes,
particular.
I think we're there, and you should make your point.
I mean, it's hard to know, but it keeps coming up, but I also
Okay,
think
we're definitely on the other
it shows that
laws
it's underpinning a lot of the discussion. But from our perspective, this is probably the most critical change that you could make to this exception. There is a tremendous amount of uncertainty that is foisted upon researchers because of that requirement that all other laws be adhered to. And it's not just the CFAA. The CFAA, of course, gets a great deal of attention, and it's certainly relevant, but we're talking about every state law, and not just computer crime laws. We're talking about environmental laws, driving safety, et cetera, et cetera. It is everything. And I'll give you a specific example of a state law that directly implicates common research. Maryland, so just across the border. In Maryland, it is a crime to even attempt to identify an access code. Separately, it's a crime to distribute or circulate that access code to an unauthorized person. I just say that identifying the access code is without authorization. And this is a common feature of, for example, IoT research, where finding a hard-coded password or a very weak password then leads to vulnerabilities that cause serious flaws in IoT. And this was a feature of the Mirai botnet. We actually see this in home security and lots of other types of devices. And does it suppress the research? In Maryland, it does, right? In Maryland, it would. But if you go across the border, then I suppose you can escape it. So is there a way to work around it? Sure, but should that be the analysis? And to the question that Kevin asked, and that Mr. Amer and that Ms. Walsh had responded to, the issue is the uncertainty, but also that DMCA compounds those penalties, right? So the private right of action compounds it further, right? So if you were prosecuted for a violation of one of these laws, and you'd be facing a fine under that, then potentially a fine under CFA or DMCA. But the statute and the exemption currently don't say that there needs to be a conviction. It just says that there has to be a violation. And so it's an open question, and one that worries us, whether or not then you are conferring a private right of action to copyright holders, even in instances where prosecutors are not actually pursuing a charge.
Could you provide, is there a specific example you can give where you say, well, I'm running a risk of a gray area of a Maryland law or a specific other law, and I'm willing to roll the dice on that, but 1201 is, coupled with that, okay, I'm going to step back. Is there anything in specific? Because I think one question we have goes to adverse effects. If it's already prohibited by separate other laws, it's not clear that 1201 is really restricting this activity.
The private right of action question with 1201, distinct from criminal laws, does make 1201 a unique problem, distinct from those criminal laws. Now, what happens in these conversations is that it is the compounded uncertainty. I haven't been privy to a conversation where someone says, well, it's this plus 1201, and it's too much. What does happen, though, is saying, well, I don't think that I'm going to be facing a criminal charge for this, but I might be facing a private right of action, and that is scary because a company may have more incentive than a prosecutor to go after an innocuous problem that is security research based that might then harm their reputation. Prosecutors, in some cases, have shown greater discretion in our experience than some companies. And on the question of legislative history, which Mr. Amer brought up, the conference report, it has that door lock analogy, which I know the BSA brought up as well in their comments. I would argue in 1998, Congress did not contemplate just the plethora of laws that security research now implicates. Right? Security research has become completely decentralized. There's a machine in everything now. And so the number of laws is well beyond CFAA. That door lock analogy, which is really, unless I missed something, was the bulk of the discussion on this other laws question. That door lock analogy goes to the question of consent and lawful acquisition, which I think the Copyright Office has tried to accommodate in the temporary rule. So I think that the legislative history had not thought about things like password disclosure.
Well, I think you're asking us, or we are being asked to remove consent and acquisition limitations as well, to remove basically all limitations aside from it being security research. So just to confirm, you are or not aware of a situation where, despite another law precluding it, there's been a determination not to go forward with a research project just because of 1201. I don't know if that makes sense.
I can't say that I am. Actually, I will say that it has caused creative workarounds, and it does restrict the venue where the research may be performed. But that is it has come up, particularly the private right of action. But in many cases, what we see is that somebody then tries to, as I said, tries to shift where it occurs to avoid a law, or, sorry?
Yes, they didn't do the project they're going to do.
Or they did it elsewhere. I will also just note that these laws, when it comes to the uncertainty, it's always changing, right? So the uncertainty that exists for researchers is constantly in flux. State laws are changing very quickly. Georgia, this is happening right now, and even they're passing a new computer crime law that removes mens rea, that removes any sort of changing of data as a requirement, and the legislators themselves. We've been listening in on the hearings and speaking to the legislators. They themselves are not entirely sure how security research fits within exceptions that they've created. There's been a lot of speculation about that, and so even if the legislators don't know, I think it is very, very difficult to say that security research ought to know.
But isn't that uncertainty still going to exist, even if you have the applicable law limitation drop from the 1201 exemption? I mean, you're still going to have to abide by these other laws, right? And so if there's uncertainty about those other laws, that uncertainty is going to continue whether or not it's referenced in the 1201 exemption or not.
The uncertainty is going to continue, but at very least, the private right of action and the compounding effect of DMCA would not be present. For DMCA, I mean, let's not overlook the potential effect that a private right of action would have on the researcher. I mean, it's not just $2,500 in statutory damages. It's also the potential for impounding equipment, attorney's fees, discovery costs, and so forth. And for a researcher, particularly one that is not backed by legal representation, that's completely devastating.
Thank you. So to sort of keep the discussion going back and forth, I know that Professor Halderman's had his placard raised for a while. So if you could answer the same question I asked Mr. Geiger, and then we'll go to Mr. England.
Well, I wanted to point out a scenario that I would worry about even more, and something that's actually come up in my work is cases in which we are being very careful to comply with the legal requirements on security research, but an aspect of the legal code that has no real bearing on security comes up. There was a case fairly recently where I was doing research with some devices that we had bought, and the grad student who plugged them in used an improperly rated extension cord, and this was found to be in violation of the electrical code. Is that then, after that is there and documented, that in the process of doing the research we had inadvertently violated the law about the electrical code, going to expose all of that research and the fruits of it to liability under the DMCA?
So have you been stopped in doing any research where you think it is in violation of another law, but it's really the 1201, the private right of action or compounding effect, as Mr. Geiger said, that is making the difference as opposed to knowing of the other law, including this electrical socket?
It certainly causes me to have to go and talk to the attorneys and have much more careful conversations about whether we are safe, my students and I are safe in proceeding with the research. I am a researcher in a relatively protected position, being someone operating out of a public university with the resources of that university and its legal department behind me. But I think someone who is not in that position, someone who is a researcher operating privately, or an amateur investigator who is nevertheless contributing to the safety of the public, might be in a much worse position.
Mr. England?
Yeah, I just very briefly like to agree with the thrust of the questions that have been coming from the Copyright Office for the last few minutes, and disagree with some of the responses that have been coming from the proponents. there's been talk from the proponents about the office extending the effect of other laws or creating a private right of action, and that's exactly backwards. Congress created prohibition on circumvention, and with it a private right of action. The office is being asked to grant an exemption from that, and there's a statutory standard for when the office can grant such an exemption. That's when the prohibition in Section 1201 is adversely affecting a non-infringing use. If an assertedly non-infringing use is unlawful, it isn't Section 1201 that's adversely affecting it. So it should not affect anybody's behavior to keep this provision in or take it out, but highly consistent with the statutory standard that governs the action that the office has to take to leave it in, because there can't be an adverse effect from the prohibition in limiting activity that is already unlawful.
Another question related to that, and then I'll let Professor Reed respond to both questions. That you just spoke about whether or not 1201 is acting as the adverse effect of the causation requirement, but do you think in the instance where the activity that would be engaged in is barred by another law, does that affect the fair use analysis? Such as like Harper and Rowe, if you're doing something in bad faith?
Yeah, potentially. There's certainly judicial authority that indicates that the intent and good faith of the person engaging in an act is relevant to fair use. Obviously, the four factors are non-exclusive. Courts have occasionally considered other factors. So I think if somebody were engaged in unlawful activity, that could factor into the fair use analysis. I just don't think you need to go there, because there can't be an adverse effect.
Professor Reed?
If I can respond and tie back to a point that was made a while ago, and I promise I'll get to this question of other laws and fair use. I want to get back to the notion that was raised about the First Amendment having been resolved and remeritus in other cases. I think we're in a very different factual situation here, and it's one that really bears on both the controlled environment limitation and the other laws limitation, which is that security research isn't just about the circumvention. It isn't just about identifying the vulnerability, but it's about reporting that vulnerability out. And in some cases about an activity that is core to our democracy, right? Determining whether a nation state is hacking an election, right? Determining whether there's security vulnerabilities in the machines that are used to administer an election. And in a case where permission might not be forthcoming, and circumvention is not just one of the convenient ways by which you might obtain this very important information. It might be the only way to obtain this information. So in effect, 1201 serves as a gateway to effectuating First Amendment speech. And to Ms. Walsh's point, the Copyright Office has got to identify at a bare minimum to survive constitutional scrutiny a really, really good reason for imposing these limitations. So the question is not in this case, and I think we've demonstrated some good reasons why you should get rid of this, but you also need to independently identify a good reason to keep these limitations in. Now, I appreciate on the controlled environment limitation, Mr. Troncoso and others have suggested we might adopt a very narrow construction of what controlled environment is and all of that sort of thing. But I would ask you to think about what exactly is the policy reason that the office is including that limitation. And what it sounds like is that policy limitation is every legal regime that somebody might use against a researcher, if anything from something malicious to something that's an accident happens. Likewise, with this other laws regime, you are literally importing into the DMCA every other law. Literally every other law. So that's everything from the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and if you've seen the Sandvig case in the last week, a law where there's an incredible amount of uncertainty. There's circuit splits on virtually the definition of virtually every single term in the statute, all the way on down to the electrical code, which the building inspector could theoretically show up and enforce, but is never going to do. So I think when you view all of these questions in light of the First Amendment, you have to say, why are we importing every other legal regime into what's supposed to be a fairly narrow question, which is are there impacts on copyright infringement that are going to result from the circumvention of technological protection measures? And there's nothing on the record to suggest that that's the case. And so I think, again, that's the reason that we're asking to remove both the controlled environment limitation and the other laws limitation.
Thank you. Did you want to speak into whether, if activity was in contravention of other law, whether that would affect the analysis on whether the use is likely to be non-infringing or not?
I think in general, the answer to that question is no. So the fair use analysis, again, we're looking at a transformative use, and in particular one that is aimed at not impacting a legitimate market for the underlying copyrighted software. There's no interest in infringement being demonstrated. And the question of whether that activity might, say, violate the electrical code, I don't think that's a winner, that suddenly fair use doesn't apply because you've violated some local ordinance. So I think in general, the answer to that question is no.
Well, what if it was, this is obviously a sort of out there hypothetical, but to do security research, we drop the limitation on, primarily for security research, and it's also to steal money or something. Is that still likely non-infringing?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the hypothetical. So the idea is someone who's going to commit some kind of larceny or something, and then is also on their way to that doing security research?
No, I guess they're engaging in circumvention and they're cloaking it, saying they're doing security research.
So this is an argument that's come up, to the best of my knowledge, in every single hearing back to 2003 since the first security research exemption was adopted, was the idea that this is somehow cloaking some kind of piracy or some kind of illicit activity. To that I can only say the folks who are represented on this panel here are never engaged in that kind of activity. But moreover, there's never been any assertion in the record of any actual incident of anyone within the ambit of the exemption or anyone adjacent to the exemption actually invoking the exemption to get out of something, to your point, theft, to the point that Mr. Williams and others have raised, copyright infringement. In fact, there's very little evidence in the record that Section 1201 is ever used at all to deter just about anything. So the idea of maintaining the existence of all of these limitations in the law when there are such profound First Amendment interests at stake on the basis of what are frankly completely hypothetical concerns that in more than a decade and a half have never been substantiated, we really don't think is warranted.
Thank you. Mr. Hall?
Thank you. So I'm going to stick to the CFAA specifically since it's called out specifically. The CFAA prohibits exceeding authorized access on protected computers. Protected computers is a very broad definition. It's basically anything that is connected to a network capable of affecting interstate commerce. One thing that's been changing quite a bit is software is also increasingly cloudy. Increasingly, software is provided from something that's off the device. And so there are things like cloud-enabled door locks where yes, you have a key, but you also have a way to use an app that will authorize via cloud service the door to unlock for some period of time. The other law's limitation here allows companies to add liability under 2 statutes to their threat arsenal for essentially contract enforcement. Companies can effectively use pretty aggressive terms of service and end-user license agreements as access controls to the access controls. They can use both the breadth of CFA's coverage to preclude research that would otherwise fit within the exemption. The research report that we submitted as part of the record shows that disclosing vulnerabilities is one of the riskiest things that a security researcher can do. That's often the moment that things get legal and heated very, very quickly. Nearly every legal threat on record is triggered by an attempt to disclose these kinds of research findings. But that means that it's incentivizing researchers to keep their work quiet. And when they feel safer keeping information to themselves, no one benefits. And so if we can remove the porting of a vast quantity of other laws, including the CFA, which is just this miasma, into the calculus security researchers have to make with circumvention of TPMs, that would dramatically improve the state for security researchers seeking to engage in those kinds of activities.
Thank you. Mr. Geiger, you can have the last word on this limitation, and then we'll start to talk about the last two.
So this other laws clause, and it seems causes a great deal of uncertainty in both directions, right? So for researchers, but then also for concerned stakeholders, rights holders, who, whether unintentionally or intentionally, to introduce fear, uncertainty, and doubt, seem to regularly confuse this question of liability. If you look through the record, this happens pretty frequently. The election providers talked about accessing election software on the computers of local election officials, right? Creating a new threat that federal, state, local government officials must defend against. The National Association of Secretaries of State, they talk about unfettered election hacking activities if this were removed. SIIA, too, mentioned being permitted by the DMCA to hack flying aircraft or building climate control systems. There is a sense that, one gets the sense that if other laws were removed, some stakeholders have the impression that then there would be no law, that it is a get out of jail free ticket for researchers. And one of the concerns that we have is that reliance and the attention on DMCA Section 1201 is sort of preventing an evolution of regulation and making security researchers more aware of these other laws. And instead, folks are just relying on Section 1201 as their gatekeeper. Absolutely, the other laws apply. Security researchers should be made aware of that, but the incentive to try to deal with security researchers in regulation, make them come to a compromise, which is happening some places, but many, many places it is not, and to put forth educational material on both sides, the incentive is taken away when 1201 is so easy to rely on. To Mr. England's point about how other laws that behavior won't change, I wanted to make very clear behavior did change, right? I mean, and I described it. Maybe Ms. Walsh had the right answer that the research that I described was not able to go forth in the venue that it was originally selected. It did have to move because of local laws. So behavior does change. Now, are there ways to get it done? If you have enough resources, possibly, but it does take some creativity. So it is absolutely chilled.
All right, thank you. I think given our time, we're going to move on to the last two limitations and discuss them in tandem. So the access limitation, the current regulation says that circumvention, the work should be solely for the purpose of good faith security research. And the so-called use limitation is that the information derived from the activity is used primarily to promote the security or safety of the class of devices. And I think both of these sort of go on a really broad topics towards this should be for good faith security research. And so I guess I'll just tee up a broad question why these limitations are not important to keep. I think BSA has said maybe some of this is sort of misunderstood, I guess, that primarily to promote security doesn't mean only to promote security. There's been some concerns that this might prohibit publication of academic papers. I'm wondering, do any opponents agree with this, or do they think, no, actually the Copyright Office can clarify that post-circumvention publication for an academic or other uses is permitted and not prohibited by the current regulation. So, Mr. Hall?
So I just wanted to get my tent up quickly to make a very small point, which is that and I think Andrew Matwishin's filing at some point made this point, which is that often the fruits of security researchers are other expressive works, like academic papers. There's a really good example of one that is, you can check it out. It's called Have I Been Pwned, Pwned, and it's a way for you to figure out if you've ever been included in any data breach that we know about, and that requires having fruits of the security research that are things like, access codes and things like that we can check against. And so I just wanted to put a pin in the ground and say, on some level, these are other forms of expressive works, and we've heard a little bit about that in terms of the First Amendment concerns. But, specifically when we get to the solely useful for, that means you can't do the kind of work that I like to do, which involves taking the fruit of research and making practical tools that people can use to protect themselves. Another example is the 500 million password list. There's actually a list on the internet of 500 million passwords. People like me can use that when we design systems to make sure that if you put in any password that we've ever known has been breached before, we just say, no, please try again. It may be pretty frustrating, but it's not as frustrating as you think. So the solely for the
But in that case, the
security-
circumvention is still for security research, right? So I'm wondering what,
But the use you're making is not necessarily solely for those purposes, correct?
And specifically to those two examples, I don't think it's fair to characterize either as even implicating the DMCA, because the have I been pwned example is an example where a researcher monitors sort of the dark web to see when people are selling or making available lists of people's credentials and gets them that way. They're not sort of behind an access control, and then creates a database where you can essentially ping the database to see if you're.
Not true. So I was going to get to that, which was.
We can go down a rabbit hole, but
I was
either
going to
way.
get to that, which is that, often when you're doing this kind of research, you run into things like lists of credentials, like malware.
I'm not questioning that a lot of your research does implicate the DMCA. The two examples that were just provided.
So a lot of the passwords that were produced from that 500 million list are specifically mined from devices that have technological protector measures on them. Anyway, so,
I just also wanted to jump in quickly because it's I think, a critically important distinction that there's an access limitation and a use limitation. The access limitation has a solely in front of it. The use limitation is not bound that strictly. It is used primarily to promote the security of software. I think in virtually every example that is in any of the papers that have been submitted as part of this proceeding, all of the research we're talking about is done for purposes of security research. Otherwise, what are we here to talk about? The question is whether you can take knowledge that you've derived from that research and use it in an educational setting. That's where the use limitation comes in. And as long as you're primarily using that information to promote security of the class and it's not used in a manner that facilitates copyright infringement, again, I don't think that these types of uses are implicated, and I think that there's, in fact, in the 2015 recommendation, the Copyright Office made reference to the fact that sort of some of the activity that was involved on that record would involve follow-on sort of educational uses. So again, I just don't want to get us into a situation where we're reading these things so narrowly and in such an unreasonable manner, and then hanging our hats on that to say, look, we need to change the 2015 exemption because it's possible someone is going to misread that statute. Ergo, we should just not have any limitations at all in whatever 2018 exemption is recommended by the office. That's sort of my principal concern.
I mean, to pick up on that, I mean, that's helpful. To the proponents, I would ask, is the concern basically that this somehow could be read to, I mean, I think you alluded to this in your comments, that this somehow governs the conduct of third parties and what they do with the research that you publish? I mean, to me, that seems a little far-fetched, just given that what this is talking about is, this is providing an exemption for the party that is doing the circumvention, and it's laying out conditions that are required to be eligible for the exemption. I don't know that it is reasonably read to
But isn't the case that if I publish research and that research is then used subsequently to infringe copyright, and it's not something that I necessarily thought of or could predict, that then that affects my exemption under my liability under this exemption? I think so.
You're saying that you're...
So say I publish a paper or something, and within it has some morsel someone uses to mint whole copies of the software I studied or something.
I mean, I think it would turn on, whether you as the circumventing party, as the researcher, were primarily, whether your intention was primarily to promote the security or safety of the class of devices. I
hope so.
Well, the question is where the word primarily appears in the rule, right? I mean, it says and is not used. It seems broken off from primarily as the modifier. And I mean, our filing recommended putting primarily in there again to make clear that those third-party scenarios, which are very real for security research because a lot of vulnerabilities are publicized, and they can, if they're not patched, they can be used for good or for ill. But to make clear that it's not on the researcher if an unintended and unforeseen third party then goes and uses it in a manner that infringes on copyright infringement.
I mean, so this language, as you know, tracks the statute. This is the phrase that appears in 1201J. I suppose we could, if it were an active voice, I mean, would it say that the researcher does not, that the researcher acts primarily to do that? I mean,
So our suggestion is simply to include the word, and others may disagree, but our suggestion was simply to include the word primarily again in that last part of the phrase, so that it is primarily not used for copyright infringement. And in our experience, in most cases of security research, right, the fruits of the research are used primarily for computer security, and so you will often make a vulnerability publicly available through several different systems, CVSS, and then which can then be used for penetration testing to improve security, but they can also be used by individuals who are fishing around for old vulnerabilities that haven't yet been patched. And our concern is making sure that the research is not suppressed because of that particular scenario. I think it's a relatively easy fix. And just to an earlier point that was made about pwn to own, I interpreted what Joe was saying as emphasizing for the record that security research is not just a non-infringing activity, that it is also, it implicates copyright because research itself spawns a host of other creative works. I mean, there's the research, there's academic articles, journalism that comes from the research, there's further research that is conducted, and software patches that, and then new operating systems that avoid the old vulnerabilities. And often when we're talking about Section 1201 being used in these contexts, it's to suppress the research, which then in turn suppresses those creative works. And I would, in fact, in most cases, I would argue that 1201 is asserted to stop the publication. It's not even the research. It's just that they don't want the word to get out, which is itself, a spawning other creative works. So it is not just a security research as in something that doesn't implicate copyright on the researcher side either.
I'm not sure who was next. Mr. Freeman?
And so I'm actually going to go further on that because this is actually the part that I am least comfortable with in the current wording, and the thing that I actually was most wanting to be here in order to address. I actually am not sufficiently comfortable with just adding primarily, and the reason why is that it is just so difficult to determine what somebody is going to do with information. You might think that people are going to use it for all sorts of things, and it turns out that the primary thing that people end up doing with it ends up being something that's infringing. And the reason why this actually really ends up mattering in the wording is Mr. Troncosa mentioned that where the word solely is, but the word solely is actually in the text twice. So the word solely says it's solely for the purpose of good faith security research, and then good faith security research is defined. It includes the word solely there, but the word solely was already now applying to that entire definition. And then if you read that definition, essentially just in its plain wording of it, it states that purposes of this exemption, good faith security research means accessing, okay, yada, 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 where that activity is carried out in a controlled environment designed to avoid any harm, yada, 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 where the information derived from the activity, yada, 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 is not used or maintained in a manner that facilitates copyright infringement. And so you end up with this scenario whereby somebody has performed an infringing activity, but that is exempt because it was for security research. It was actively designed when the person was doing it. They really did truly have the purpose of good faith testing, investigation. Their goal was to do security work. And then they go and they publish the research work on it. And it turns out that the thing that they actually ended up tampering with also happens to be the primary mechanism that, for example, an iPhone uses in order to do the encryption of the application. And it wasn't even clear when you were doing it that was what was going, that you were enabling that.
Well, in that
but now you have
instance,
facilitated that infringement.
Wouldn't the circumvention be solely for good faith security research? in your example? I mean, I'm sort of sympathetic.
But the information was, the problem was is that by having published that information, you were now in violation of that the information derived from the activity
Right, so
is
we're
not used
past the
or
solely
maintained.
limitation, though, right? You would have
The
been-
solely actually applies to that entire clause because back in the definition, it says that computer programs where the circumvention is undertaken on a lawfully acquired device or machine on which the computer program operates solely for the purpose of good faith security research. And then good faith security research is defined. So the solely actually applies to everything related to good faith security research, not just to the second usage of solely, which applies in 7.2. And so what we're looking at here is trying to strike both. And I remember specifically in the petitions, it was stated that our goal is to strike both the usages of solely, not just one of them.
Well, but I mean, you know, even if this use clause could be read somehow to apply to the conduct of third parties, which I think is questionable, you know, you have primarily there. So I mean, you know, that gives you some additional flexibility. I mean, if there might be some circumstance where someone down the line, some third party uses your research to facilitate copyright infringement, you know, isn't that sort of that possibility? Aren't you protected in that circumstance by the fact that it says primarily and not solely once again?
So first of all, I will argue that I actually believe that this clause absolutely was put here in order to work on the third-party infringement that occurs down the line. That is why it is about the information and the way that that information is maintained after the activity. It is on the information that was derived from the activity, the way in which it was maintained, and that maintenance of that information could end up facilitating copyright infringement. Then the usage of the word primarily as it currently stands in the documentation is limited to the primarily to promote the security and safety. It is not applicable to the used or maintained. That was an addition, which is what Mr. Geiger was hoping to add, is to put the word primarily on and is not primarily used or maintained in a manner that facilitates copyright infringement. But I don't think that actually that actually is sufficient in a way, because that still leaves open the possibility that the third-party infringement that ends up occurring after the point of fact of the publication of the information that now has been poorly maintained from the activity ends up getting used in a manner that happens to be primarily for infringement, and that was in no way something that anyone would have determined at the time when they were doing the research primarily for the promoting the security and safety of the class of devices.
Mr. Williams, did you agree with that reading, or did you otherwise want to speak as to how these limitations are relevant to, from a copyright owner's perspective?
Sure. So the clients I represent, preserving free speech rights is kind of one of the foundational reasons they exist. So we're not here to try to step on anyone's free speech rights, and we're not here to try to oppose publication of scholarly works. On the other hand, preserving copyright protections, and the cases have said preventing unauthorized access to copyrighted works is a countervailing free speech interest. And if you look at the cases I referred to previously, Ramirez and Corley and Elcom, they'll all discuss that. And so I don't think the right place to draw the line is whether is to say if any third party is involved at all, then that's not on the researcher, for lack of a better word, because if you look at these cases, in particularly the dissemination early on of DCSS, it was very clear, even though some of them said, well, we're just researchers, we're just doing this as a point of study, they were setting up websites to intentionally attract other people to download a product and then strip circumvention. So some of that did involve downstream usage, but was also found by the court to be unlawful, and also unlawful in a way that was perfectly within the bounds of the First Amendment. So I think you have to be careful there. I'm not opposed to trying to come up with a way to draft this that preserves people's academic rights and right to engage in study and publication, but that also does not enable that kind of widespread dissemination of code that will immediately get people access to copies of works in the clear when they haven't paid for those copies. The courts in these cases have a lot of metaphors, but one was a metaphor of an epidemic that can't be cut off at the source, because once it's released, it spreads virally, for lack of a better word. And that's what can happen in these cases if misuse is occurring. So I just think you have to be careful there. Personally, I don't think adding primarily where they're suggesting it would be a good idea, although I think I understand what they're getting at. But to say that it's not primarily used or maintained in a manner that facilitates infringement, to me, that would imply that if 90% of the time they're not engaged in infringement, but then 10% of the time they did themselves even directly engage in infringement, maybe they'd still be covered, which I don't think would be your intent. So if you do try to do something with the language that protects good faith activity, I don't think that would be the best drafting.
Thank you. I think we're getting tight on time, so maybe we'll just start going back and forth on this topic. So I think Professor Halderman, you were up next. Mr. Kamada? Okay.
We just wanted to quickly say that we've been, I think, turned to discussion at 1:30, and we've been talking about it for 15 minutes. So the ambiguity around this discussion is an already adverse effect that really does chill research in this area.
Okay, how about Mr. Zuck?
Thanks. One thing that's probably we don't have time to go into is that there are adverse effects to copyright holders and public safety for countervening technical protection measures, right? I mean, if I'm hacking a drone or something like that, I can cause damage to public safety. So there is a counterbalancing concern here, and so what this ends up being is a balance of risks. And completely understandably, security researchers would like to eliminate all of their risk, all of their responsibility, and all of their accountability in this situation, and I would want that too. And so what the net result of that, though, is shifting it all to copyright holders. Well, we published this. If you didn't patch it in time, if you didn't get all your customers to download patches in time, and somebody used it to hack your drone, that's not my fault. I'm just exercising my First Amendment right to publish my research results in a way that easily facilitated use by a third party. So I think there has to be a balance of risks here. I think the current exemption strikes that balance of risks here, and I think it's inappropriate to request that all my risks and ambiguity should be removed at the expense of the copyright owner that now needs to assume those risks to public safety. Thanks.
Ms. Walsh?
So first, I want to be clear about some of the purposes that are potentially not encompassed under solely for good faith security research, but are nonetheless often engaged in by academic researchers. And one of those is teaching. Another is publication. So often Professor Green works as part of a team with students, and part of the mission is to educate those students with the solely limitation, because solely is such an extreme word, it creates the possibility that a rights holder would argue if you had some additional purpose that's on equal footing, or even not on equal footing because it's not the same as primarily, it's not in order to, that having those additional purposes, which are also valid and non-infringing, puts you at risk of falling outside the exemption. That's why we prefer the language in the NTIA's 2015 recommendation in order to conduct good faith security research. So not to entirely litigate the First Amendment questions here, I'll just note there's a circuit split on how Section 1201 interacts with the traditional contours of copyright law, whether there's a requirement of a nexus to infringement. The cases that a colleague is referring to predate Eldred and Golan for the most part. I'd refer you to our briefs in Green v. DOJ for the details of the First Amendment argument on that count.
Can I just say that as an educator, I'm also concerned about 1201's effects on my educational speech.
Mr. Moore?
I think, well, first of all, with respect to this specific, sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. With respect to the use limitation, we have many members who are publishers of journals and so forth. This provision, the limitations on this provision have, to my knowledge, never interfered with any of their activities on a whole myriad of subjects. Many of those have, in fairness, have nothing to do with copyright whatsoever, or circumvention, but some of them do. The second thing I would say is, if you're going to look at this, and I'm not sure you need to, but in my mind, the right way to look at this is as an intent requirement. In other words, that's really what you're trying to do here, is that the elements here are, what does good faith look like? Well, good faith looks pretty bad when 99% of everything that a particular device is used for is infringement, or rather circumvention of access controls for the purpose of infringement. There's a suggestion there that maybe the reason the circumvention was performed was perhaps not a legal one. I think it's appropriate for the exemption to take note of what happens afterwards. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Freeman.
So one of the fun things with this law goes back to the earlier comments that are about good actors in the community versus bad actors in the community. And so the idea that oftentimes when we do security research and we're targeting products by a company like Apple, we end up feeling somewhat emboldened. But when we're targeting products that are by other companies, I'm just going to point out Sony, we oftentimes are just very afraid. And so you end up with scenarios like, I can bring up a concrete example here of work that was done with on Apple products, where people were reverse engineering for purposes of determining the security implications of Apple iMessage, the messaging protocol that people can use in order to talk to each other. But the mechanism by which that system is protected is Apple Fair Play, which is the exact same obfuscation technique which is used in order to obfuscate the obfuscate the encryption algorithm that is used in order to encrypt applications on the iPhone. And so the work that was published on iMessage ended up being utilized by people who were trying to understand and reverse engineer that encryption algorithm on those applications. Now, in this case, with something like Apple, I would not necessarily feel that concerned going in and reverse engineering something like iMessage. But when people do contact me about doing any form of security work or any type of research work related to anything involving Sony Online or anything involving any of the products that are released for any video game console, really, when people contact me about things related to General Motors vehicles, when people contact me about, I tell them, no, don't do there. Like, if you've got work you can do, go work on something that is by somebody like Apple or Google that's probably not going to burn you on that. But we've seen people get burned on 1201 from some of these other companies. We see those people, those other companies, show up at these panels in order to argue why these exemptions should be more limited in order to make certain that they continue to have those powers and control. I do see this kind of chilling effect occurring in the security research community related to these sections, and that's why I am very concerned about making certain that we remove some of these restrictions on this exemption.
And has that happened, for example, with automobiles after 2015?
Also, I was bringing that up because we have an explicit exemption on automobiles now, but
Right, and we're discussing whether to change it.
I'm sorry. I should not have brought up the example. I'm sorry. I will take that back of General Motors. I'm just used to General Motors being the enemy, even showing up for the jailbreak panels and saying that I think you're classifying a general all-purpose mobile computing device. That sounds like a car, and so. But yes, for all of these other devices that we do not currently have exemptions for.
Thank you. Mr. Geiger?
So I wanted to quickly respond to the concern that was raised about that use or maintained in a manner that facilitates copyright infringements, and the concern that if it was 90% used for security and then 10% used for copyright infringement, that then the researcher would still be covered. And in that scenario, I think that's an incorrect read of the exemption, because it still has to be, the circumvention still has to be done solely for the purpose of good faith testing, investigation, and/or correction. So that your circumvention of it must still be used for that. What we are concerned about, again, is third parties who then take that information and can use it. I mean, as it is now, because of where the placement primarily is, and because we don't attach it to that last part of the sentence, it is an absolute bar, it seems, on any type of copyright infringement.
So if your amendment were taken and primarily was also attached to the second part of the, the final part of the clause, that's what I think you're suggesting, is that right?
So I take the point to some of my colleagues that it may not go far enough in every scenario, but in our opinion, it does mitigate it. And the very common concern that we have is submitting vulnerabilities to, for example, the CVE database, and then it becomes public, and then these vulnerabilities are often not patched by companies that are even aware of them, and then can be used for purposes that are good or purposes that could implicate copyright. But those are all done by third parties, not the researcher. The researchers are generally almost exclusively acting solely for the purposes of good faith testing and security.
Okay, thank you. So we really appreciate everyone's time and participation. I think this is sort of last call because we're well over. So if you have your placard up, we'll get to you. But Mr. Troncoso?
On the use limitation in particular, I just want to point out that there's an amazing amount of agreement from everyone who submitted comments that sort of coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes are very important to mitigating potential third-party risks. And ultimately, we're all here to improve security, and we all sort of agree on this point. We also agree that coordinated vulnerability disclosure is not something, it's more of a norm than a science. And so pursuing some sort of different rule that is going to be stricter, I don't think is necessarily in the interest of anyone in this room. So again, I would just sort of leave you to consider, I'm open to sort of some wordsmithing where you think that there really are legitimate sort of potential ambiguity in the 2015 exemption, but I would discourage you from sort of changing elements of the 2015 exemption unless, a reasonable reading would give rise to those ambiguities. Because I think in several instances, I'm not sure that that's really the case.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, then Professor Halderman.
Yes, sorry, I don't want to belabor this, but just to respond to what I think it was Mr. Geiger said. So first he said, well, it wouldn't be a problem to put primarily where he's suggesting because you would still have the fallback that it's solely for good faith research, but they want to delete that. So that would presume that you do not grant that part of the requested expansion. And then the second piece of it is, even if they were not 10% of the time directly engaged in an infringement, if they were 10% of the time actively encouraging other people to engage in infringement in some of the ways at issue in the cases that I referenced, that would still, I think, cause a problem. So again, I think what he's put forward is a good faith attempt to try to revise the language in a way that gets to where he wants to be, and I don't think he's trying to encourage infringement, but I just don't think the drafting suggestion works quite well. And I'd be happy in post-hearing letters to weigh in on any thoughts on how to draft it better.
And just to be clear, we have not, Rapid 7 has not asked for the solely for good faith testing language to be removed. That's just our position. I understand that others have, and and I'll let their arguments carry forward. I'm not speaking in opposition to it, but we've not asked for it to be removed.
Okay, my apologies.
Professor Halderman?
To wrap up, I would like to just return to the subject of elections one more time, pointing out again that we are in a critical election year, that 2020 is around the corner, and that security research, especially research by individuals working without authorization of voting machine manufacturers, has been absolutely essential to uncovering vulnerabilities affecting many kinds of American election equipment and getting those vulnerabilities fixed. So the existing exemption and its inclusion of voting machines has been very supportive of that. I'm grateful for that. And I hope that an even more expanded exemption allowing further testing of voting machines, even in environments that are not necessarily the controlled environments that look like a laboratory, but could be other environments that still protect the safety of the general public, is something that you'll consider.
Thank you. Do you have any suggestions as to, I guess, what would that look like? I assume it wouldn't be conducting research while voting was going on, right?
Right. Well, I think the critical thing is that the research is following the norms of protecting people from harm, and not that the research is conducted in any particular kind of laboratory setting.
Thank you. Looks like Mr. Hildebrand?
Yeah, if you are considering any changes to the access and use language, we just would like to request the opportunity, that hasn't been addressed in the initial comments, opportunity to have post-hearing comments on that as well.
And which specifically?
On the access and use limitations.
Just to clarify, some of the previous discussions seem to contemplate that there might be some changes around how that exemption is formulated. And just to underscore, the notice of proposed rulemaking purported to renew the existing exemption. So we think it's critical, just as an administrative procedure and notice to all of the parties in the room here, that everybody gets a chance, if the office is doing something that's not been teed up by the record, that we get an opportunity to comment on it.
Yes, I would say typically his office, if they have issued post-hearing letters, they've done so to every participant on the panelist. So, Mr. England?
Thank you. Just to very briefly respond to Professor Holderman. The election systems providers did not oppose renewal of the existing exemption. The registrar's already said she's going to recommend that. So clearly there is some independent security research with respect to voting machines that is permitted. We do oppose and think it is unnecessary and inappropriate to make changes to that. And at one point, Mr. Holden referred to as the controlled environment. I think there is possible, as discussed earlier, that there is just a semantic disagreement here about what that means. I think it certainly the DEF CON voting village that's referred to in the comments did not take place in a laboratory in the sense that had stainless steel countertops or something. It seems like a controlled environment to me. It was not a live election, and so whatever you do here, it ought to be very clear that hacking voting machines during real elections is not permissible, and despite the fact that simply deleting that requirement might permit that. And as Dr. Holden said, obviously this is an election year, but and we had an election year last year and the year before. But all the intelligence information, security information that's available to my clients and me is that no actual voting was compromised in the 2016 election, and I think it's a mistake for the office to think that what will save the next election is having people hacking voting machines. There are many layers of security that are created by local election officials, backed up by security that is built into the systems that are used in voting, including some TPMs that are relevant to this proceeding, and also other federal assistance through the Department of Homeland Security and Election Assistance Commission. It is not the Copyright Office's job to ensure the security of the next election by granting the exemption that's been requested here.
All right. Thank you, everyone. A lot to talk about. Appreciate it. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.